my name is Zudra, and this is the Introduction to Judging video. This is in preparation for the Hart House InterVarsity Debating Tournament that is coming just around the corner. In this video, there will be two sections. In the first part, I'll go over note-taking and flowing and how to write arguments as they are being spoken during the debate. In the second part of the video, Eric will be going over some weighing mechanisms, how to actually make a judgment, and contribute meaningfully in a panel discussion. I hope you find this helpful, and let's just jump into it. So normally you would start off with two pieces of paper and you would divide them like this. You would have one piece of paper for the front half and one piece of paper for the back half. While the debaters are introducing themselves, it's very important to write down their names as well as their pronouns if they indicate it. Somewhere on this piece of paper, perhaps up here in the top margin, you might also want to write down the motion so you can reference it later on in the debate if you're unsure of the wording. So starting off with the PM speech, you want to start writing the notes under the appropriate column. So in this case, the first thing you would write is their signposting. Now, a lot of judges skip over this part, but if you're new to debating, it's particularly useful to keep track of this so you know what to expect from the speech. As you go along, you want to definitely write down definitions as well as model in case they're ever contested in the future. And then you want to start writing the arguments. So just as debaters are encouraged to do pale while they are doing their speech, judges are encouraged to write down everything that is being said so they can recall during deliberation. This is also a great way to follow along during the debate and make sure you're understanding the arguments that are being brought up. You would do the same thing for as many arguments that they bring up, and that's essentially how you would flow for the first speech. Moving on, you would do the same thing for the leader of opposition in this case. For clash, a lot of judges find it helpful to write in a different color so it stands out. Also, it can be very useful to use arrows to track the flow of arguments between different speakers in the round of the debate. Next, you would want to continue with the arguments that they are presenting. In the case that a debater is asked a POI, I personally like to keep track of it in green. I write the speaker that gave the POI and the question that was being asked. Right below it, I will write the response that was given by that speaker. Going back to the importance of writing down signposting, when you actually do that, you have the ability to determine whether or not the speakers actually did what they say we're going to do. So in this case, the speaker, leader of opposition, only brought up the first argument and not the second argument that they said we're going to bring up. Now, you shouldn't necessarily hold this against them, but it might just be something to keep at the back of your head and maybe look out for later in their case. Moving on to the Deputy Prime Minister in this case, same thing. Start off at signposting. Again, track your clash. And in this case, they chose to do rebuilding instead of bringing a new point. Moving on to the DLO, same thing. Signposting, then rebuilding. And it appears that they ran out of time at the end of their clash, so they didn't really get to the argument that they were going to bring up. So essentially, this is the way that most judges will flow on their piece of paper. Again, they will have one piece of paper for the front half, another piece of paper for the back half. You may choose to flow either on pieces of paper or on a computer, whatever is the most comfortable for you. Please also don't feel obligated to stick with this particular layout. If you prefer any other charts, that's completely fine. This is just to give you an idea of what most judges do. One final piece of advice I would give is to avoid writing down everything that the debaters say. It's natural to not want to miss anything, but it's equally important to ensure that you understand what is being said and are writing down only the relevant information. So that is the end of the note-taking part. We will now be handing things over to Eric, who will explain how to actually evaluate the arguments in comparison to one another and how to contribute to a panel discussion.
Hey everyone! In the second half of this video, we're going to cover some other basic components of judging. So first, I'll talk about how to come up with a ranking after a debate round, and secondly, I'll talk about participating in a panel discussion. Both of these will be important at the Hardhouse InterVarsity, which might be your first time really judging or participating in a panel discussion. This video will mostly serve as a basic overview for those who are relatively new to judging, so if you're more experienced, this video might not be as helpful for you, but this is mainly to provide an overview as to the skills you'll be using at the Hardhouse InterVarsity next weekend. So firstly, in terms of how to rank teams after a debate, what I want to establish first is the general mindset that you should be in as a judge in the British parliamentary format, as well as some basic misconceptions or things to avoid, since I think half the battle is just avoiding falling into a lot of pitfalls that a lot of judges might fall into. So in terms of the general mindset, in British parliamentary debating, the average judge would want to be open-minded and willing to accept arguments to a reasonable extent. That means that you adhere to a principle of not intervening as a judge. So you as a judge shouldn't adjudicate that certain arguments are inherently better than the others because of biases you might have. As debaters, all of us have debated in rounds before. All of us have been in our own debates or ran arguments or have heard arguments. That shouldn't ideally influence your adjudication of how you are hearing arguments in the round you are currently judging. So please be cautious that when you are judging rounds, you aren't assuming that teams are doing a better job because they are running arguments that you would have thought of, or arguments that you've seen other good debaters run before, or arguments you know about because of what you're studying, or arguments that you broadly agree with. Try to remain open-minded and establish your judgments based on what the teams themselves say and how other teams interact with that, rather than whether or not you know something about this motion or whether or not you think it's just a good argument because you've heard this argument before. So that's the first key thing. Try to remain non-interventionist as a judge, not bringing in other outside experience or other knowledge into the debate. The second main thing is, as a judge, you want to be crediting things based on content in a British parliamentary debate. That means that you are crediting the analysis people give, the content behind it, the impact, the mechanisms, etc., but not necessarily the form or the structure or the style in which it was delivered in. So try and be cautious of things like speaking style, the way someone's voice sounds, the way they structured their speech, and the way they chose to speak in certain ways or spoke in certain ways due to accents or other vocal inflections. Those are things you should not be adjudicating in a British parliamentary debate. The third main thing that is important to keep in mind in terms of your mindset as a judge is you are always being comparative when you're judging in British parliamentary. VP is a particularly tricky format to judge in because of the comparisons between 4 different teams. So it's important then that you are always comparing teams to each other and thinking about how they interact with each other. So try not to be too swayed in your judgment just by saying that one team had good arguments or one team had proven their arguments well. The question is always, did this team have better arguments than the other team, or have they proven them better than another team? In addition, when you think about comparing teams, make sure you are comparing teams to each other and in isolation. What I mean by that is if you're comparing opening government to opening opposition and deciding which team ranked above the other, you should not be bringing in a third team outside of that comparison to make that adjudication. So if closing opposition did a great job refuting opening government, that isn't itself a reason why opening opposition would then beat opening government, because then you're crediting opening opposition for work that they didn't do. It was closing opposition who did the refutation. So you shouldn't bring in external teams into a comparison of very specific teams. You also should restrict yourself to things that the teams actually say in the round. So obviously don't credit refutation just because you know the response, but the teams might not have said it in the debate round. So those are all things that are really, really important when you're adjudicating a round. And basic principles in terms of what you should and shouldn't be thinking about, in terms of you should try and be non-interventionist, you should be judging on content rather than form or style, and you should be comparative, are all crucial things to keep in mind when you're judging a debate round. So in terms of making rankings themselves and comparing different teams, it often will be tricky to understand how you compare teams that have different arguments, that might talk about different things or weigh different stuff. An important thing to keep in mind is that in this debating format, we value, in a sense, quality over quantity. So it isn't enough for a team to win just because they provided more arguments or provided more arguments that stood at the end of the debate, because we care about how important those arguments were. So if a team runs a lot of arguments, but maybe they weren't logically coherent, or maybe they didn't all have a strong impact or weren't weighed in the round. Just running a lot of arguments in and of itself isn't a reason why they should win if they weren't important arguments. Similarly, it might not be enough that a team just has the most arguments that stood at the end of the debate, because again, they might not all be important, and just using the metric of, well, like who had the most arguments standing at the end often will be biased in favor of a team like closing opposition that gets to speak last and rebuild last versus opening government, which has to give arguments much earlier in the debate. So try and be thinking of quality over quantity as well. When you're comparing two different teams on opposite sides of the bench, such as opening government or opening opposition, you'll want to think about a couple of things. So when teams are arguing, they'll often present multiple categories or areas of argument. So teams will clash on different themes or general areas. So there might be a clash on a principle, or there might be a clash on a practical argument. And sometimes teams will make this explicit. They'll say this debate has been about two things, like these two areas of clash, but sometimes they won't. And as a judge, you'll want to try and pick up on that. And within each area of clash, you'll want to evaluate each team's arguments and content by thinking about a couple of steps. So when you hear an argument that falls under a certain clash or a certain area, you'll want to think, firstly, is this just a logically coherent argument? Is this a plausible argument? Does it make sense? Can I credit it? And the majority of the time, you should credit an argument that is logically coherent and not dismiss it as a judge. So given that a team has provided an argument, you'll want to think about how did they prove this argument, or how did they provide mechanisms and impacts to weigh this argument in the round? That is the basic thing that you should start by thinking about as a judge. The next step is thinking about how this compared directly to the other team. You want to think about which team built their arguments better, but also how did those teams engage with each other? So you'll think about things like indirect or implicit refutation. How did the other side try and refute this argument? And how did they try to take it down? And there are different degrees to which an argument can be taken down. So you'll want to think, when opening government made an argument, that's the first step. The next step is, how effectively did opening opposition refute that argument? Did they just mitigate it such that the impact wasn't as strong, or did they totally take down the argument and flip the impact? Did they make it seem like the argument was slightly less effective, or did they make it seem like the argument was entirely ineffective? So think about to what extent the other side refuted the argument and how much they took it down. The third step is also just thinking about, how did each side try then to rebuild those arguments, and to what extent were they successful? So after that interaction has taken place, you'll want to evaluate which side effectively engaged with the other better and did a better job trying to take down the argument or rebuilding the argument, and ultimately which side has a more credible standing argument at the end of that clash. And assuming that one side has an argument that stands and has won this area of clash, let's say that opening government has broadly won the clash about principles, you'll want to think then about, was this an important clash? So like we said earlier, the important thing is not just crediting the number of arguments that someone won on or the number of arguments someone gave, but you have to think about how important those arguments were in the debate. So when you think about which side has won, you'll want to think about within the multiple areas of clash, such as a principled clash and a practical clash, which one or which category of arguments or which area of general ideas did each side prove was more important. So let's say if you have an opening government or an opening opposition side where there were like 3 general areas of clashes or topics that they discussed, and let's say opening government has won on 2 different principled clashes and just had more convincing arguments and refutation, but opening opposition did a much better job defending their practical argument. And if that team did a better job of explaining why that argument is more important and weighing the argument, just because open government might have won numerically more clashes is not a reason they should win. You might credit the team that won a clash that they proved was important. So to summarize, when you hear an argument coming from 2 sides on different sides of the debate, you'll want to understand, is it a plausible argument? Can I believe this? Like, does it make sense? And how well was this argument built up? 2, how effectively did the other side refute the argument? To what extent did that refutation take it down? 3, did each side defend the argument successfully in rebuilding? And 4, once you have decided which team between opening gov and opening op has won which area of clash or which argument, you should then understand how did each team prove which arguments were most important. And the sides that are likely to win in these debates are those that not just won some areas of clash, but specifically those that proved that the areas of clash that they won on were more important than the other sides. Given that debating is an exercise of both truth and importance, you'll want to understand which sides prove the more important clashes, and that is often how you will be able to come at a decision as to this side in opposition, the opening opposition, beat the opening government because they won on these more important clash points, which they explained were more important. So that's essentially a step-by-step process as to how you can think about comparisons between teams on opposite sides of each bench. And importantly, you're thinking about this in terms of teams, not in terms of sides, because there are 4 different teams, and the opening might do great, but the closing might not. On that topic, how can you compare an opening team to a closing team? You'll want to think similarly about truth and importance. Between an opening and a closing team, they aren't directly in conflict with each other, they're not directly clashing with each other, but you'll want to evaluate closing teams in terms of, are they providing a sufficiently new contribution? Is that contribution substantial in the debate? And does it prove something that opening government was missing or was lacking, or did it weigh itself against opening government in a way that explained why the closing case is more important? And a strong closing case is one that is not only somewhat new, but even if it's somewhat similar to opening, or regardless of whether it's new, did the closing team explain why it was more important than opening? Did they fill some hole in the opening case? Did they do a better job at dealing with the other side? Did they fill in an important impact? And was it clear to you as a judge why this was an important contribution in the round? So when you're thinking about closing teams, try to think about not just how new the material is, but also how important of a contribution it was as well. Finally, when you're making a ranking, you will ultimately use a lot of that kind of thinking. So thinking both in terms of the first thing I described of the process as to how to compare teams on 2 different sides of a bench, like opening government to opening opposition, and also comparing opening to closing teams. And you'll come at a ranking that goes through 1 through 4, which teams you thought were the most compelling and won on the most important clashes. And that type of thinking is how you come to that ranking. So once you have a ranking in mind, based on those general principles of judging, the next step then is participating in a panel discussion. After every round of the Hard House InterVarsity, the judges panel, which is led by an experienced chair who will guide the discussion, but is equally just one of the judges, you will essentially have a 15-minute deliberation period to go over everyone's rankings and try and come to a final decision. So the way that panel decisions will work, for most inexperienced judges, you will likely be one of the panelists and be helping and supporting that discussion, is after the round has ended, the chair will usually provide 1 to 2 minutes for everyone to just review their notes and come to a decision. During this time, you should reread your notes, see if there's anything you missed, anything you're unsure about, and try to come to a general ranking in the debate. After that, the chair will usually guide a discussion that tries to get the opinions of all the panelists in the round and come to a call that people are generally happy with, or if there isn't consensus, at the end of the 15-minute deliberation period, there will be a voting process. So as a panelist, it's essentially your role to help provide the chair with useful advice, feedback, thoughts about the round that will help determine the ranking. So what will often happen is that the chair might turn to a panelist or say generally, could someone please summarize why this team's case beat this team's case, or could you please summarize the arguments provided by the opening government team, or etc. When that happens, as a panelist, you should try and provide a clear explanation as to why something happened in the debate based on what you observed in the debate, not necessarily based on your own intuitions or based on your own external knowledge, but reference things that happened in the debate. So if a chair turns to you as the panelist and asks, could you please explain why opening government arguments beat opening opposition's arguments, you should try and do 3 things. So first, you should try and explain in clear and objective terms that don't reference personal preferences why you adjudicated this way in the debate. So reference things that happened in the round, reference reasons why logically a team beat another team rather than relying on personal justifications as to how much you liked an argument. 2, You should try and reference specific things that happen in the debate as much as possible. So try to avoid being vague and try and reference specific areas in which teams clashed. And 3, as a panelist, because you are often on a judging panel of multiple people, try to be brief. Try to summarize quickly but helpfully. You want to highlight the main points and main areas that you noticed in the debate. So if you are summarizing something and your chair has asked you to provide a contribution, try and limit that to like a 30-second explanation or like at most a minute-long explanation. So you want to try and be brief, but also be very helpful. You don't want to waste too much of the panel's time, given you only have 15 minutes, but you want to provide a clear overview as to why you felt this way. So essentially, the chair will guide discussions to try and compare teams to one another and try and get everyone as close as possible to a consensus call. If that doesn't happen, at the end of the 15 minutes, you'll vote on a call, and the majority will carry in most cases, or some tournaments have a chair rules policy where the chair's vote will carry. So that is essentially how a panel discussion usually goes. So just to review in this video, we've discussed firstly how you can come to a ranking of different teams. And we've discussed both the mindset that you should be in as a judge, things you should avoid in terms of bringing in personal biases or considering style over content. And we've also discussed how to make comparisons both between teams on different sides and teams on the same side. Secondly, we discussed how to participate in panel discussions. It's essentially a helpful learning experience for you to learn how to judge and understand how you can create better justifications for your reasonings and also participate in a panel discussion. Your chair is there to help you out as much as possible, and just don't be afraid to participate and use some of these tips to make sure you're participating as productively as you can. So that's all I have. Hope you have a fun time at the Hardest InterVarsity and you learn a lot from judging.